Mrs. Tompkyns, an excerpt from Chapter 17 of The Education of Uncle Paul by Algernon Blackwood. Coffee Break Collection 36, Cats. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading is by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Mrs. Tompkyns. The psychology of sleep being apparently beyond all intelligible explanation, it was not surprising that Uncle Paul woke up the next morning as though he had gone to bed without a single perplexity. He remembered none of the thoughts that had thronged his brain a few short hours before. Perhaps they had all slipped down into the region of submerged consciousness to crop out later in natural and apparently spontaneous action. At any rate, he remembered little enough of his troubles when he woke and saw the fair English sun streaming in through the open windows. Odors of woods and dew-drenched lawns came into the room, and the birds were singing with noise enough to waken all the countryside. It was impossible to lie in bed. He was up and dressed long before any servant came to call him. Downstairs he found the house in darkness, doors barred and windows heavily shuttered, as though the house had expected an attack. Not a soul was stirring. The air was close and musty. The idea of having to strike a match in a country house at 6 a.m. somehow oppressed him. Not knowing his way about very well yet, he stumbled across the hall to find the door, and as he did so, something soft came rubbing against his legs. He put his hand down in the darkness and felt a furry, warm body and a stiff, upright tail that reached almost to his knees. The thing began to purr. "I declare," he exclaimed, "Mrs. Tompkyns!" And he struck a match and followed her to the drawing-room door. A moment later they had unfastened the shutters of the French window, Mrs. Tompkyns assisting by standing on her hind legs and tapping the swinging bell, and made their way out onto the lawn. The sunshine came slanting between the cedars and lay in shining strips on the grass. Everything glistened with dew. The air was sweet and fresh, as it only is in the early hours after the dawn. Very faintly, as though its mind was not yet made up, the air stirred among the bushes. Paul's first impulse was to waken the entire household so that they might share with him this first glory of the morning. Probably they don't know how splendid it is. The thought of the sleeping family, many of them perhaps with closed windows, missing all this wonder, was a positive pain to him. But fortunately for himself, he decided it might be better not to begin his visit in this way. "I guess you and I, Mrs. Tompkyns, are the only people about," he said, looking down at the beautiful gray creature that sniffed the air calmly at his feet. "Come on, then. Let's make a raid together on the woods." He threw a disdainful glance at the sleeping house. No smoke came from the chimneys. Most of the upper windows were closed. A delicious fragrance stole out of the woods to meet him as he strolled across the wet lawn. He felt like a schoolboy doing something out of bounds. "You lead and I follow," he said, addressing his companion in mischief. And at once his attention became absorbed in the animal's characteristic behavior. Obviously it was delighted to be with him, yet it did not wish him to think so, or if he did think so, to give any sign of the fact. Nothing could have been plainer. First it crept along by the stone wall delicately, with its body very close to the ground, as though the weight of the atmosphere oppressed it, and when he spoke it turned its head with an affectation of genuine surprise, as though it would say, "You here? I thought I was alone." Then it sat down on the gravel path and began to wash its face and paws till he had passed. After which, when he was not looking, of course, it followed him condescendingly, sniffing at blades of grass en route without actually touching them, and flicking its tail upwards with sudden electric jerks. Paul understood in a general way what was expected of him. He watched it surreptitiously, pretending to examine the flowers. For this, he knew, was the great cat game of elaborate pretense. And Mrs. Tompkins, true adept in the art, played up wonderfully, and incidentally taught him much about the ways and methods of simple disguise. It advanced stealthily when he wasn't looking. It stopped to wash or gaze into the air the moment he turned. It was very shy and very affected and very self-conscious. Inimitable was the way it kept to all the little rules of the game. It walked daintily down the path after him, shaking the dew from its paws with a rapid, quivering motion, then suddenly arching its back as though momentarily offended at nothing, it stared up at him with an expression that seemed to question his very existence. "I guess I ought to fade away when you look at me like that," was his thought. "I'm here, I'm coming, Mrs. Tompkins," he felt constrained to remark aloud before going forward again. "The grand morning excites my blood just as much as it excites your own." It seemed necessary to assert his presence. No intelligent person can be conceited long in the presence of a cat. No living creature can so sublimely ignore. But Paul was not conceited. He continued to watch it with delight. One very important rule of the game appeared to be that plenty of bushes were necessary by way of cover, so that it could pretend it was not really coming farther than that particular bush where it was hiding at the moment. Instinctively, he never made the grave mistake of calling it to follow, and though it never trotted alongside, being always either behind or in front of him, the presence of the cat in his immediate neighborhood provided all sorts of company imaginable. It had also provided him with an opportunity to play the hero. Then, suddenly, the calm and peace of the morning was disturbed by a scene of strange violence. Mrs. Tompkins, with spread legs, dashed past him at a surprising speed and flew up the trunk of a big tree, as though all the dogs in the county were at her heels. From this position of vantage, she looked back over her shoulder with hysterical and frightened eyes. There was a great show of terror, a vast noise of claws upon the bark. No actress could have created better the atmosphere of immediate danger and alarm. Paul had an instinctive flair for this move of the game. He made a great pretense of running up to save the cat from its awful position. But of course, long before he got there, she had dropped laughingly to the earth again, having thus impressed upon him the value of her life. "A question of life or death that time, I think, Mrs. Tompkins," he said soothingly, trying to stroke her back. "I wonder if the head gardener's grandmother, after whom you were named, ever did this sort of thing. I doubt it." But the creature escaped from him easily, for no one is ever caught in the true cat game. It scuttled down the path at full speed in a sort of canter, but sideways, as though a violent wind blew it, and desperate resistance was necessary to keep on its feet at all. After that, its self-consciousness seemed to disappear a little. It behaved normally. It stalked birds that showed, however, no fear of its approach. It sniffed the tips of leaves, it played baby fashion with various invisible companions, and finally it vanished in a thick jungle of laurels to hunt in savage earnest, and left Paul to his own devices. Like all its kind, it only wished to prove how charming it could be in order to emphasize later its utter independence of human sympathy and companionship. End of Mrs. Tompkyns, an excerpt from The Education of Uncle Paul by Algernon Blackwood.